Glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of the book of Ruth. We've gotten a chance to look at the first two chapters of Ruth, really setting us up in the narrative of what's going on, introducing us to the main characters. And now we're coming to kind of the climax of the story. And there's a lot going on that we've talked about as far as kind of the themes of Ruth, and those are really going to start to get unpacked here in Ruth chapter 3. So we're excited to dive into this, excited to have Trey Haskett and Greg Kline both with us again to continue this study. Appreciate you guys being here. And we're going to dive into Ruth chapter 3. Before we get too deep into the text, though, Trey, kind of remind us a little bit about where we're coming from chapter 2 and how this verse 23 is kind of a big pivot point for us here.
Yeah, so it's been a couple of weeks and probably good to go back and review a little bit here. Back in chapter 2, we had encountered Ruth and Naomi, this widowed woman, really two widowed women, coming to the land of Israel, coming back to Bethlehem, the place of bread. And you remember why they left was because there was a famine in the land. So they leave the land of promise. They go to a foreign land, to Moab, a place where Israel and Moabites really didn't get along. These are kind of long been enemies in the history of God's people. But they go to the land of Moab, and then they become widowed. At least Ruth and Naomi and Orpah do. And Ruth and Naomi decide to come back to the land when they hear that God has blessed the land and now there's food. And so that's going to be a really key theme that a lot of this book is unfolding by what's going on with the food and who is being provided for and how is that working. And so chapter 2, we started to see, okay, now Ruth and Naomi, they're back in the land. These are two widowed women, would not have been taken care of. How are they going to provide for themselves, or how are they going to be provided for, we should probably rather say. And Ruth goes out and she goes into a field and she meets this very generous man, Boaz, who takes care of her and is very generous towards her and lets her glean in the field as long as the wheat and the barley harvests are going on. And so she has a means to provide for her and for her mother-in-law, Naomi, during this time. But when we get to verse 23 of chapter 2, it says, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And so now those harvests are over, and the question is, how are we going to provide for ourselves now? And you remember the way that Naomi has been characterized in this book. She's someone who moves with the food, so she leaves the land when there's no food in the land. There's food in the land again because God has blessed it, so she comes back to the land. And now by the time we get to chapter 3, again, her concern is, okay, how are we going to provide for ourselves? How are we going to take care of ourselves? How are we going to get bread to put on our table so that we might eat and so that we might be sustained? And so all of that really kind of sets up where we're going in chapter 3 with, let's get us something to eat to provide for ourselves. And so Naomi's going to have this plan in order to do that. Andrew, you want to talk more about Naomi's plan here in the first 5 verses of chapter 3?
So as we're transitioning into chapter 3, we've noted that Naomi and Ruth are in a very precarious situation. We've already talked about how this is during the time period of the Judges, and this is a dangerous place to be in time. It's a dangerous location in Israel, and it's particularly dangerous for women. As we talked about with the end of the book of Judges, women have faced terrible decision-making by men. And right now, Ruth and Naomi do not have a male protector. And so Naomi's main driving force seems to be the acquisition of an heir or someone to provide for her and her daughter-in-law. And we see that even back in chapter 1, where she talks about how she doesn't have a son to provide Orpah and Ruth with a new husband. And even if she did, it would be too young for them to do so. And so her mindset is very much in this idea of acquiring a male protector figure. And again, that's very understandable given the time frame that we're in. Well, with that in mind, let's look at what Naomi is going to be saying here in chapter 3. It says in verse 1 that Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you," exactly what we're talking about, "that it may be well for you? Is not Boaz our kinsman, with whom maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies. You shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." There is a lot going on here that should raise red flags. One commentator put it really well that if this is not a risky plan, it is at the very, or if this is not a risqué plan, it is at the very least a risky plan. There is a lot of euphemism going on here, potential euphemism, and there's a lot of context going on here. The harvest time was in general a time of fertility. It was a time of potential activity. We see this actually all the way back in Judah and Tamar, that this time period of he's going up to shear the sheep, and it's a time of renewal and everything. And it's not a surprise to see a prostitute during that time. So this is already, from a cultural context of Israel's time period, this is already a time period of ancient Near Eastern culture associated with fertility and associated with this concept. Well, Naomi tells Ruth to put on her best clothes. She's putting on clothes to indicate her availability as a young woman. And then she is to go to Boaz after he has finished eating and drinking. So he's full, he's been drinking his wine, he's already in a cheery mood. Again, we're seeing potential for a time that Boaz is susceptible to such things. It then says that when he lies down, you shall go and uncover his feet. Now, to our modern ears, that sounds really weird. We're like, okay, wait, why would you uncover somebody's feet? Like, are you just trying to make him cold? Like, are you tickling his feet? What's going on here? Well, the word feet is used as a euphemism, and typically for things a little bit higher than the feet. And so when you uncover the feet, you could be uncovering up to the calf, up to the knee, potentially even up around the waist area. It doesn't always mean that, but the euphemism is there. Now, remember what we've talked about, the idea of a Moabite woman. The Moabites in the Old Testament have a literary character. They are a type, they're a stereotype, a trope. The Moabites are seductive people. We see Moab starts with one of Lot's daughters seducing her father and having a son through him. We see the Moabites are the ones that seduce Israel into sin under Balaam's direction. Ruth is a Moabite. It's been hammered into us several times in the text. Boaz is aware she's a Moabite. Naomi is aware she is a Moabite. And so to put a woman coming from a race known for seduction in good clothes, to go at a time where fertility is already a discussion, and to uncover the feet, whatever that may mean, you can see there's a lot of suggestive language going on here. And then Naomi tells Ruth that whatever he tells you, that's what you do. We're a little concerned for Ruth here because, again, in the context of Judges, this has not worked out well for women. And we're even more concerned where in verse 5, Ruth says to her, all that you say, I will do. And so there's a lot of tension here in the text that, again, we may not pick up from our English translations, but a Hebrew reader would be reading this and be like, ooh, this seems like a really dangerous plan. Even though we know the good character of Ruth and Boaz up until this point, we're almost kind of waiting for the shoe to drop. But what's going to happen is actually pretty surprising compared to what we've seen in the past. So, Greg, tell us a little bit about what's going to happen here when Ruth and Boaz actually do meet.
I think what you said is a really important point for this next context, the idea of Ruth and Boaz's character. Because as you think about that, it becomes a little bit irreconcilable. Is Ruth going to do this unthink of problematic thing? Is Boaz going to all of a sudden act like a normal Israelite during the time of Judges, so to speak, or the stereotype? Or are they going to continue being in their different form? I think for this context, right before we go through some of 6 through 11 in particular, think in your minds back to chapter 2. Now remember, Ruth has come with Naomi into the land. She's working really hard. And this is noticed in chapter 2 and verse 7. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reaper. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now, in that work, she showed her work ethic. She showed her desire to help and take care of herself and maybe even Naomi and some others. But as you look at this, what happened next? She got the attention of Boaz. Now, Boaz all of a sudden has some sort of special place in his heart for her. Maybe not romantically, but he notices her. There's something interesting, different about Ruth. But notice very carefully what he says. Andrew did a good job breaking down some of the potential context of the words there. But there's a word that's repeated, and it's not at all the way that we would normally take it. In chapter 2 and verse 11, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, that phrase, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, is very important. Because as we come into chapter 3, what is the ultimate goal of Naomi and Ruth, regardless of what the method is to get there? It's that Boaz would redeem her, that there would be marriage. And so you see that in verse 9. Notice the word here. He said, "Who are you?" when he realizes who she is. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." All right, this idea, wings, is the same idea from chapter 2 when Boaz says, "The Lord will spread his wings of protection over you." Just like in chapter 2, I believe there's this vision. Boaz is obviously not God, but there's this protection that Boaz is willing to offer Ruth when she's in the field. He's willing to give her refuge. He's willing to give her what she needs, provide for her in similar ways to the way that God took care of his people Israel. And now here Ruth is saying, "Please take me into this marital covenant." Much like in the book of Ezekiel, God would use the phrase that I took the people under my skirt and had a covenant with them. Again, this idea of this linking and joining in a special covenantal promised way. And so what is Ruth doing? Well, does she do something untoward? Does Boaz take advantage of her? Not at all. As you look at the first several verses, verse 6, she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Now, some of that language is instructive for us. It helps see that literally her location was near the feet of Boaz here, and that's important. And as you keep reading, of course, she makes this kind of request, verse 9, of redemption. But notice his reaction in verse 10, very important. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." Now, lot to unpack there. One of them is, notice Ruth's description, a worthy woman. Very important that this Moabite woman is the worthy woman in the story about Israelites and the Israelite God Jehovah. But also, when you look at that description, worthy woman should be a good person. But then we have this narrative problem in verse 12. She wants Boaz. Boaz is a great guy. Ruth is a worthy woman. This is meant to be, right? Well, sort of. What's the problem? There's a nearer redeemer, which means Boaz knows legally she should not be his, at least right now. So again, consistent with the character of both Boaz and Ruth, nothing untoward would have happened here. But as you go to verse 10, there's this weird phrase, "You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Why did Ruth need to be redeemed? Well, her husband had died. And so what was Ruth marrying for? What was her goal? Well, it wasn't just for her to find the most attractive young guy to marry. It wasn't for her to find whatever is the most thankful person that she would be interested in. There's this unselfishness. She's continuing on a certain lineage. She's trying to help Naomi. Ruth's character of unselfishness once again shines through here, and Boaz sees it. And yet, once again, the unselfishness and the care of Boaz comes out, and then he says, "Do not fear." How many times did God tell his Old Testament people, Israel, "Do not fear"? Why? Because I'm with you. I will provide for you. I will make sure you have what you need. And that's what Boaz says. He's not perfect like God, but he makes sure that she's going to have what she needs. If he's not going to do the redeeming, he'll make sure he finds the one legally who should and will. And if not, as we know in chapter 4, he will take care of her. And so at the end of verse 13, then, "As the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." You're going to see that she goes out to avoid any problem with propriety issues from a visual standpoint. So this starts out really negative, starts out really shaky. Boaz might take advantage of her. Ruth might be doing something a little bit untoward. That's not what happened. Ruth is dedicated to doing the right things. And Boaz is dedicated to taking care of her. You see all kinds of the imprint of God on this story. Whereas Boaz takes care of Ruth, Ruth is unselfish. And so then there's this powerful phrase in verse 11 that she's a worthy woman. And as we think about this, you really find this to be an interesting place in between Judges. And really, as you work towards this concept of the Proverbs 31 woman, Ruth really stands out as a good example, doesn't she, Trey? What do you think about Ruth and how she fits in there?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's just interesting to note in our English Bibles, the book of Ruth comes after the book of Judges and certainly fits in that context. And that's why we read those things in sequence. But in the Hebrew Bible, this actually comes right after Proverbs 31. And we're all familiar with Proverbs 31. It's that description of the worthy woman, that excellent wife who can find. And so here it seems that part of the way that this story is functioning is to show, Greg, as you said, here a Moabite is now a worthy woman. And what a wonderful thing that is. We talked a little bit, I think, in our first episode as we were introducing all of these things, sort of this idea that we get from Westerns, right? You got the people with the white hats and the people with the black hats, and very obvious who they are, right? You know, the white hat people are the good guys, the black hat people are the bad guys. It's not very often in Scripture, within biblical narrative, that we get a explicit statement, this is a good person. Most of the time that's revealed through their actions and through their dialogue, as we've seen in this story thus far. Ruth's hard work, her dedication, her commitment, her loyalty, her kindness. Same thing with Boaz, his kindness, his generosity, his hospitality. Naomi, on the other hand, we're certainly not putting her in a white hat. Maybe as we started this and as we're hearing maybe what it is that Naomi's suggesting that Ruth do, maybe that comes as a shock to us. Maybe we don't quite want to put her in a black hat. That may be where some of us are, but she's certainly not one of these white hat characters. Ruth, however, it comes out and it says explicitly, she is a worthy woman. She is worthy of praise. She is excellent. She is this woman of great character and strength. It's the strength of character. That's what she's got. That's what she has. And we see both her and Boaz, again, they are redeeming characters, if we can sort of use that play on words here. But as we get to verse 14, and this really continues on with that, they're concerned that the situation, how it might be perceived, how people might look at it, and what might be the implications of what's going on here. And so just notice verse 14, it says, so she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. Well, why is that important? Because they are concerned that if somebody were to look at this situation, they're going to start making a bunch of assumptions. Again, we've got a Moabite woman, somebody who's known for being seductive, laying down in an open place with this man where they would have had some privacy. Boaz is laying away from all the other workers. And so this just wouldn't have looked very good. And so they don't want to give any sort of cause for shame here. And so what they do, they rise up early. He sends her out, doesn't want anybody to know that she's been there, not because something happened, but precisely because it didn't happen. And so we're going to send her out. But when he does, we continue to see that generosity again. So he puts 6 measures of barley on her, a lot of grain that she's been given here. And she's sent back to her mother-in-law. Her mother asks, how does it fare, my daughter? How did it fare, my daughter? And she begins to tell her all that Boaz had done for her. I want you to notice, though, verse 17, as Ruth is relaying what happened, she says, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, you must not go back to empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And I think that's a little hint here in the story about what God is doing in this situation. So you remember back in chapter 1 when Ruth and Naomi, they come back to Bethlehem, to the place of bread, and everybody's like, oh, Naomi's back, Naomi's back. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for my life is very bitter and God has afflicted me and I have come back empty-handed. Well, now she's no longer going to be empty-handed anymore. And she's no longer going to be empty-handed for the duration of her life because of what is going to continue to transpire in this story and Greg, I think you were mentioning this a little bit, where we see God working on the one hand and Boaz working on the other. And really these two figures are working together. They're working simultaneously, God working through Boaz. And so in that way, God is blessing this family. He is, they have come under the wings or the refuge of God now in the person of Boaz, who is this redeemer. But again, there's that little teaser because maybe there is a redeemer closer. And so maybe this story won't work out with the fairy tale ending that we think it should. Andrew, do you have any more to say about any of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, Trey, I thought you brought out a really good point here, that there is a parallel between what God is doing and what Boaz is doing. And we drew this similarity earlier of the idea with Greg talking about Boaz earlier has said, the Lord has spread his wing over you And then Ruth asked Boaz to spread his wing, his covering over her. And I think as we're looking at application, I think that's one of the things that we see comes really clearly through this text, is that there's very little directly attributed to God. There's a lot of surprising circumstances. There's a lot of things that seem like they might be random chance, which seems to be pretty clearly room for God to be working through these things. But one of the ways that God is most active in this story is through his people, particularly through Boaz and through Ruth. You see what it looks like for people who are faithful to the law, people who are faithful to godly ideals, people who are faithful to Yahweh themselves. They manifest Yahweh-like attributes. They manifest Yahweh-like behaviors. And I think that's a really good application for us to focus on as Christians. Do we pattern ourselves after Christ when we are interacting with oppressed like Ruth and Naomi, when we're working with those who are less fortunate? Do we seek to be God's mercy to them? Do we seek to exhibit God's characteristics to them? And I think that's one of the cool things about this story, is that we're going to continue to see it in chapter 4 as well, is that these faithful and righteous characters act like God. And through them, God is able to work some really incredible things, leading all the way up to, one of the most important stories of the Bible with David. And I think as we look for, how do we apply this story to our lives, we should be looking, am I a Boaz? Am I a Ruth? Am I somebody who has so known the law and so internalized the law of Christ that it just flows out through me, that I'm naturally generous, that I am naturally looking to be protective of the less fortunate, that I am naturally looking to do things in the right way, that I'm not seeking to cut legal corners. I'm not, getting rid of this other Redeemer guy because who cares about him? He's not important to the story. I'm making sure that things are being done in a proper way. I'm making sure that appearances are maintained so that people's integrity and holiness is maintained. Are we doing these things not for personal sake, but so that God can shine through our actions? And so when we talk about applications, that to me just kind of screams out with the character of both Boaz and Ruth, that they are exhibiting Christ-like and really God-like in their terminology, but in our terminology, Christ-like behavior. And so to me, that just kind of screams out of this text. Greg, what do you see as we're kind of getting into application? What are you seeing here?
I think the key phrase in this chapter, and really a lot of the book, is selflessness. When you look at Ruth, almost everything she does in every chapter screams selflessness. In chapter 1, she was willing to stick with Naomi. In chapter 2, she's working diligently in the field. In chapter 3, she comes in an appropriate format, we might say overall, to Boaz. And in chapter 4, of course, I won't spoil that, but there's some selflessness there too of Ruth and part of her redemption arc and helping Naomi once again. And so as you think about Boaz, of course, he is selfless. And selfless is good. And when we do good things that benefit us anyway, it's easy to be selfless. But when we have to give up something we otherwise might want, that's a challenge. So think about Ruth here and think about what Boaz said again back in verse 10. He had said, you have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. Ruth could have basically not even gone back with Naomi, but even getting past that, she might have gone for a particular type of man. But she didn't. Why? There's a selflessness. She wanted to take care of Naomi. She wanted to take care of herself. She did what the quote-unquote right thing to do was, whether or not that's what she wanted on a surface level. Then you have Boaz, who is a little bit more constricted by law, but selfless to the point of submitting to that law. There's clearly some sort of connection between Boaz and Ruth here. And yet, Boaz says very clearly in verse 12, I am a redeemer, but there's a redeemer nearer than I. And so he makes sure the law has to be carried out. And that's one of those lessons for me and for us is, being selfless is important, but following the law, no matter what it says, is important as well. To fulfill all righteousness means I have to put myself aside. I can't just do whatever feels good, looks good, or is convenient. I have to do the right thing always. Ruth does that, whether it's hardworking, thinking of others, or Boaz protecting others, as you rightly said, Andrew. You look at this section and you just see selflessness is all over it. Then we think about the people. And the people of the day of Judges, what did they do? They did what was right or wise in their own eyes. Selfishness. God had done what for the Israelites? So he does what for us? Everything. God is selfless. He gives us everything. He allows us free will to exercise, whether we're selfish or selfless. And God really doesn't get a whole lot out of the package of us. In fact, we do a lot to just make him upset. In fact, when you think about Romans chapter 5, Jesus died for us, not because we would future maybe be great people. He died while we were sinners. He died while we were enemies. He died when we were weak and ungodly. That's what God does. He loves anyway. Selfless, sacrificial love. You see that from Ruth. You see that from Boaz. And if we're going to love others the way God does and the way Jesus did, we have to love selflessly. Trey, what do you see in this section as way of application as we wrap up?
Yeah, Greg, I really appreciate what you're talking about with selflessness and doing the right thing. And I want to pick up on that and maybe a more particular application of that. We're in Disney mode. I mean, that is, I know, Greg, you're kind of always in Disney mode. You love Disney and Gas. I know you're in that stage as well, just with where your children are. But we've been watching a lot of Frozen 2. And one of those songs in Frozen 2 is "Do the Next Right Thing." And I think about that and I apply that here as we're reading in Ruth chapter 3. And we see, I mean, everything is teed up to be a very sultry type situation with Ruth and Boaz here. I mean, Ruth has anointed herself. She's washed. She's put on clean garments, just as Naomi has suggested. She's gone to him in this sort of isolated place where if Boaz wanted to, he could have very well taken advantage of Ruth and maybe taken it exactly where or possibly where Naomi was suggesting that it go. And yet he doesn't do that. And so he's a person of integrity. What do we do when other people aren't looking? What do we do when we're put in situations where there is something tempting in front of us, as this certain situation certainly would have been? But they make the decision, and I would suggest it's a decision not that they just made in the moment, but something that we're already seeing in the character of Booth. The character of Ruth and the character of Boaz, they're not so conjoined yet at this point in the story. Character of Ruth and the character of Boaz, that both of these are worthy people, that these are people of great character. They've got integrity. And that's something that we need to strive to have as well. Am I someone who always does the next right thing? Because I've already made up my mind that that's what I'm going to do, regardless of the situation, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of whatever temptation might be before me. And so, Greg and Andrew, I really appreciate being in this study with you. I thank you guys for your thoughts, and it's great to be back and doing this again. Andrew, I'll send it over to you as we sign off here. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely. I want to thank both of you guys, both Trey and Greg, for joining us on this. Been a good study to continue. We're going to conclude next time with Ruth chapter 4 as we reach the pinnacle of the stories. We get to the conclusion as we kind of put together what is the purpose of this book? How does it fit into the broader story of the Bible? Why are we being told this story? Is it just a good story for us to understand, or does it reveal something about how God works through the Word of God? So we will hopefully see you next time. Thank you so much for participating in this study. Looking forward to concluding it next time.